In this video, I want to talk about oolong tea, particularly the production process of oolong tea and how flavor formation happens during that process. There's 6 steps total, and I want to talk about what we're doing in each step and how each step contributes to flavor formation. I have some video clips from different times that I've been producing oolong tea in the past. I have some data from scientific research that will help us get a more in-depth understanding of the topic. And then I also have a little bit of interview material that I got with my friend Ajin, who's a tea master. He makes black, oolong, and green tea.
已经到了烘焙箱里面，
对，
我闻到了，我问他，哇，很香啊，有奶香，有花香，所有的乌龙茶应该有的香气都差不多都在，我觉得应该做啊，我们还没喝，我们等一下回去喝，但是我觉得已经做得不错了。你能不能给我们介绍一下你这一批茶从昨天开始到今天到现在的工序，大概一个一个来讲一下。
乌龙茶其实这个茶很神奇的，我们采摘回来是闻起来没有香气，但是做出来为什么那么香呢？
这一点挺有意思啊。
对，这个是工艺上很多就是通过它契机它那个本来它那个原料是非常好的原料，是吧？乌龙茶的原料都是比较高香型的原料，我们再通过一些我们加工的手段去不断的去激发它那种香气。今天你刚刚也闻到我们做那个茶，至于怎么喝起来是怎么样子呢？我们还不是很知道。对，因为刚刚在焙火的时候是闻的。
香气是一件事，但是滋味道是另一件事。
对，因为刚刚整个车间都是那种花香啊、奶香啊，还有一些甜的味道都有。对，其实你说我对这个茶很深的研究，我就是没有，但是我通过这个不断的去摸索它嘛，摸索它，研究它，茶叶这种东西是很神奇的。
Let's get right into it. I want to start with step 1, which is plucking. It doesn't matter what tea you're making, could be black, green, oolong. First step is always plucking. However, black and green tea pluck a bit differently than oolong tea. In those other tea types, you're normally just plucking the top of the tea shoot. So that's the first bud here, and then the first leaf, maybe the first 2 leaves like this. That's a pretty standard pluck for a green or a black tea. With oolong, on the other hand, you want to pluck a bit further down the shoot. Right, so instead of just this top part, you're also getting a 3rd leaf, maybe a 4th leaf with it. So that is kind of the thing to keep in mind with oolong plucking. And the reason we do that is that step 3 that we'll get to in a second is called bruising. We're going to be tossing around the leaves a little bit, inflicting a bit of wounding stress, which we'll talk about in a second. But we need to keep a bit more of the leaf because these lower, older leaves have more cellulose, more stiffness, more structure to them. So that is going to be important, and making sure that this top tender part here doesn't get too damaged, doesn't get too bruised. Another point is that with oolong plucking, we want to keep the stem. So we're not just plucking the leaves like this. We are leaving the whole stem, and the stem does not contribute particularly to aroma, but it does contribute to taste. It increases the total L-theanine content in the finished tea product, which is going to increase the umami, savory, and sweet profile of the taste. So that is good. So we leave the stem on, we pluck nice and far down, and we end up with something that looks about like that. Maybe an extra leaf, but like this, give or take. Now that we are done plucking, we're going to move on to step 2, which is withering. And before we get into withering, I want to talk about a concept that's going to underlie the next 2 steps and a lot of steps in tea processing in general. There's a concept that's really important to understand, and that's called plant stress response. Plant stress and plant stress response. Basically what that means is that every organism on Earth, whether it's fungi or bacteria or plants or animals, we all endure stress. Life ain't easy. So we have these different mechanisms to respond to environmental stresses. And for humans, for example, our main stress response is an increase in cortisol. That's our major stress hormone, and that is what helps us in that fight or flight moment. That's kind of our main stress response mechanism. But plants, on the other hand, they don't have arms or legs with which to fight or flee. So they have evolved their own stress response mechanisms to meet the unique stresses that they face as plants. The stresses that they face as plants generally are divided into two categories. You have biotic, which means it comes from other forms of life. So those are fungi, bacterial pathogens, you have insect pests. Those are biotic stresses. And then you have abiotic, which are not derived from other life forms, which is temperature stress, whether hot or cold, drought stress, UV irradiation stress, salt stress, pH stress. So you have these other just environmental factors that can stress the plant. And when plants get stressed, there's a number of reactions and plant stress responses that get activated. One of the major pathways of plant stress response is the activation of the terpenoid pathway. Terpenoids are organic compounds that are really common in plants. There's tens of thousands of different terpenoid compounds. They're really diverse, a huge category of important plant compounds, and they mediate a ton of different processes. The plant stress response is just one of them, but they are really important in mediating that plant stress response. So when plants get stressed through biotic or abiotic stress, they will upregulate the metabolic pathway, the creation, biosynthesis process of terpenoids. They create these terpenoids, they build them up, and then they emit them into the air. And so those are called terpenoid volatiles. Volatiles are just small compounds that can be airborne and travel through the air, and generally they have an aroma, so we can smell them, and they can mediate different processes that way. Now, maybe you're thinking, this whole concept sounds kind of crazy. Plants get stressed, they create terpenoids and emit them into the air. It might seem like a new idea, but it's actually something that, whether you knew it or not, you're already familiar with. And there's a classic example that I want to bring up to kind of help you feel more familiar with this topic, and that is the smell of cut grass, right? If you're walking down the street, you can smell when someone just mowed the lawn, or you can even be down the block pretty far away and you can smell that nearby someone just mowed the lawn. And the reason is that there's the species of plant, there's that grass, and it was cut in half by a lawnmower propeller, which, as you can imagine, is very stress-inducing for the grass. And so the blade of grass has activated its plant stress response, and it has started to create aroma compounds and emit them into the air as part of its stress response. So if you know the smell of fresh cut grass, then you are already very familiar with plant stress response, plant volatile formation and emission into the air. So that is the idea that we're working with when we are processing and producing oolong tea. Tea plants have their own stress response, and they respond to very particular stresses in very particular ways. And some stresses inflicted in just the right way will get the tea leaf to respond by creating these specific terpenoid volatiles that to us smell really good. They're floral, they're sweet, they're fruity. They are what create the aroma of oolong tea. So that's the pathway we're trying to activate. And so what we're doing in the next processes is targeting that pathway specifically. So how do we do it? How do we get this tea leaf to start building its terpenoid profile and creating and accumulating these terpenoid volatiles? Step 2 is withering. Withering essentially is just laying the leaves out, and you're letting them just sit out, evaporate water, and they get softer, more supple, and pliable. There's a very big distinction to make in withering, and that is the distinction between indoor withering and outdoor withering. Solar withering. So when you're solar withering outside, you're able to activate that terpenoid metabolic pathway at a level that you can't even approach with indoor withering. It's extremely important to get the tea leaves under the sun just for a little bit. When the tea leaves are under the sun, it's a big stress. It's a big abiotic stress for the tea leaves. It's multiple stresses together, actually. It's a UV irradiation stress, you have heat stress, and you have drought stress, all working together to get the leaves to start activating these different pathways that we want them to activate. When tea leaves are being withered under the sun, you can have different plant hormones, stress hormones. They're called plant phytohormones. One is called abscisic acid, ABA. Another is jasmonic acid or methyl jasmonate. These are plant phytohormones that mediate the stress response. So these hormones, it's kind of like pulling the fire alarm, right? So you had this big stress, these phytohormones increase in concentration. Once those levels are high, then other pathways start activating. Some data showed that tea leaves solar withering had ABA levels that increased 25-fold. And ABA is an important drought stress response. So tea leaves are under the sun, withering, they've been plucked, they've been removed, so they have no water source anymore. They're going through this big drought stress. The ABA levels increased 25-fold. Jasmonate-related phytohormones increasing as well. And the difference between how much they elevate in response to outdoor withering is completely different to how much they elevate when they're indoor withering. It's a huge difference between the two. So it's really important. If you're trying to activate that terpenoid metabolic pathway, it is extremely important to get the leaves under the sun just for a little bit. A very recent study showed that even 15 minutes of solar withering, just getting under the sun for 15 minutes, was enough to significantly activate some of these pathways that we're targeting. And it reminded me actually one of the first times I was making oolong tea, it was cloudy. It wasn't sunny out, and the tea master was bringing the leaves out under the sun. And I asked him, is that going to do anything? And he kind of laughed at me. And to him, it was such a silly question because through his experience, it had become obvious that even getting the leaves under the sun for a second, just like if the sun pops out for a minute or two, that's going to make a huge difference in the final aroma profile of the tea leaves. So just a little bit of sun exposure makes a huge difference. And so that kind of brings up another interesting point about tea production, and that is the role of weather. Now, you would think that by now we wouldn't be so dependent on whether the sun comes out or what the weather is like in order to make good tea. But the reality is that tea production to this day is highly dependent on weather. You know, whether it rains during plucking makes a big difference. How much the sun comes out, how hot it is, the humidity, all of these things impact significantly the different enzymatic activities that are taking place in the leaf. And those enzymatic activities are what create aroma.
其实我们就是做这个乌龙茶，先看这个天气，因为天气很重要。因为我们一般做这个乌龙茶要选择晴天。为什么晴天呢？因为它要晒青。晴天的茶青，它那个含水量也没有那么足。
I've heard stories in the past of tea masters kind of reflecting back on this one day they had, you know, years and years ago when they were making tea. The level of sunshine was just the right amount. The temperature was good. The humidity was good. You had the perfect amount of everything. Not too much and not too little. And that day, they'll say, on that day, they made the best tea they've ever made in their lives. And they've never been able to recreate that same tea. Just to hear them kind of reflect back on, oh man, everything, the stars lined up perfectly for me that day, and I got that one perfect batch. And I've never been able to do it again since. So weather is a big deal. For other steps in processing of other tea types, weather is going to stay an important factor. Okay, so let's recap with withering. Get the leaves out, lay them out, spread them out, get them under the sun. Even a little bit of sunshine is good. The phytohormones increase, that jasmonate and that ABA, those go up. Those are going to go and kickstart other metabolic processes, our terpenoid metabolic processes. That's going to get activated. Aroma volatiles are being made. Also, during solar withering, the catechin biosynthetic process. So the natural pathway for catechin and flavonoid formation, and those are the compounds that create bitterness and astringency in the tea leaves. Those get downregulated during solar withering compared to indoor withering. So in solar withering, not only do you have the activation of the terpenoid metabolic pathway, but you also have the deactivation, the decrease of the flavonoid and catechin metabolic pathway. What that translates to is more floral, fruity, sweet aroma and less bitterness, less astringency, and a more mellow, smooth flavor. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about solar withering. We're talking about activating these important processes, talking about targeting the pathways that we want and deactivating the pathways that we don't necessarily want. That is the key to solar withering. Now we gotta have the water content come down. We want the leaves nice and pliable and soft. And then once we are at that level, you can already smell the aroma is really strong. We move on to the next stage, which is bruising.
我听说窑性做青这个工序是乌龙茶最关键的一个步骤了。
对，
这是对它的香气形成还是最关键的。
对。其实晒青是一些辅助的工序，晒一下激发一下香气， 摇青还有更高，就更促进它那个香气的生成。
All right, step 3, bruising. What we're doing with bruising, we basically take the leaves, we put them on these little mats. That's one way to do it. You can also put it in this larger trough. You put it on these machines and you have them tossed. Back in the day, this was all done by hand. Now, this is a very labor-intensive process. It's really difficult. So it has been mechanized, and I think that's a good thing. Having this process mechanized doesn't really affect flavor that much, but it also really takes a massive burden off of the producers of tea. So this process is mechanized. You're tossing the leaves for about a minute or two. Then the machine stops. You open up the leaves. You spread them out really lightly, softly, and then you just let them sit for about an hour. Then you come back an hour later, you toss them again. You basically repeat the same process. You're tossing the leaves, moving them around, gently opening them up and letting them sit. So what's happening here is that in the last process, withering, you had the organelles, the little compartments within the tea leaf cell, their membranes were becoming more permeable. So you have the catechins that were in the vacuole, kind of the storage unit of the cell. The membrane of the vacuole is becoming more permeable, so the catechins, as you toss them around, the catechins are leaking out into the cytosol, and they're interacting with oxidase enzymes. Polyphenol oxidase and other oxidase enzymes are meeting with the catechins, and they're starting to oxidize the catechins. So this starts the process called polyphenol oxidation. You'll commonly hear this referred to as fermentation. It's not microbial fermentation, but people have been saying that word for so long that, you know, whatever, I don't have a problem with it. As long as we're all on the same page that catechins are meeting with their respective enzymes, they are being oxidized into catechin dimers and polymers. These are larger structures, they're darker in color, and they're also smoother, a bit more mellow and less tannic. So as you're tossing the leaves, you have the outer rim of the tea leaf beginning to brown. That's the part that starts to oxidize first. And the core of the leaves stay green. And this is kind of the essence of oolong tea in a way. So if it's totally green, the whole leaf is green, that's a green tea. If you let the entire leaf oxidize, then that's a black tea. But right in the middle, this hybrid space between green and black tea is oolong tea.
让它氧化，因为通过不断的摇，就通过很多气体摇青破损那个绿，我们所说的三红七绿那个效果。
三红七绿。
对，绿叶红镶边嘛。对。
三红是外面的那一部分，然后里面气70%的叶面左右，就是里面的还是绿的。
对。
And so you have a spectrum within oolong tea. You'll have less oxidized or more oxidized oolong tea, but right in the middle, you have a tea leaf with a brown bruised outer rim and a green core. Also, you have another abiotic stress added here. You have wounding stress. So you have the terpenoid pathway continuing to activate. And so with each bruising, you give another chance for these enzymes and substrate to come into contact and allow those terpenoids to continue forming and accumulating.
不断的去摇它，然后呢，那我刚才所说的那个红边，对，破损了以后，
三红七绿，
对，破损了以后，它那个氧化。那个我们做的时候，它就是碰一下，见过一段时间，还有看那个香气，还有没有闻起来有没有清的感觉？对，有没有清的感觉？因为我们每碰一次，它会散发出一些清气、青草气。这个清气呢，就是我们不断的氧化它嘛，氧化它就是产生那个甜纯度，就你碰的越多呢，它那个甜度呢会增加的，就不是说碰多少次为好，这个不能说，因为要看那个茶青，决定它要摇多少细青或者碰多少细青，还要不断的去摸索。
So it's really important to give it that stress and that rest, and so that slowly builds the aroma over time. You can think about it kind of like going to the gym and you want to build muscle. The way that you build muscle is not by just doing push-ups until your arms fall off. You got to go do, an hour of lifting, and then you got to go home and you got to rest for 2 days, and then you got to come back. You got to stress and rest. So a lot of biological systems, when you're trying to accumulate something, over time, that's how you do it. So that's what's happening with bruising. We do stress, rest, stress, rest. Wounding stress, that allows the enzymes, the substrate to interact. The aroma continues to form as that terpenoid metabolic pathway continues to be activated. The catechins, those bitter compounds, are meeting their oxidase enzymes and they're transforming into less bitter, less astringent compounds. So it's kind of a continuation of withering in a sense. The terpenoid metabolic pathway, we're continuing to target it, we're continuing to work with it and give it these new stresses that activate it. So the aroma continues to build and form through that mechanism, and then you also continue to have the downregulation, the deactivation of the catechin and tannin biosynthesis pathway. So that's going to continue decreasing the bitterness and astringency. It's going to continue to just smooth out and mellow out that flavor. So these last two steps, the withering and the bruising, they're different steps, but it's kind of one continuum of plant stress and plant stress response. We are using the innate enzymes in the leaves and the tea plant stress response mechanisms to create and build the flavor that we want in our finished oolong tea product.
是通过很多次的摇青，大概是6、7次吧，不断的去摇，摇它那个。感觉它很甜醇的那个效果，就可以继续下一个工序的进行。
That about does it for bruising, right? We got the outside, the rims bruised, but the core is still green. We have our catechins continuing to oxidize. We have our terpenoid pathway continuing to activate and build those floral, sweet, fruity aromas. And at a certain point, after 6, 7, 8 repetitions of this tossing and spreading out and letting sit, we are going to have our flavor at the exact point that we want it. And we want the enzymes to stop working, stop doing their enzymatic thing. So that is when we take the leaves and move on to step 4. Step 4 is kill green. That's a direct translation from the Chinese, which is Sha-Qing. You might also hear fixing, enzymatic fixing is another translation. We are taking the leaves and we're putting them inside this piping hot cooker. This thing is 300 degrees Celsius, which is almost 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The important part here is that these last 3 steps, the plucking, the withering, and the bruising, those took a long time each. The plucking took all morning, the withering all afternoon, the bruising took all night. You know, by the time you finish those 7 different repetitions of an hour each, it's already 3, 4, 5 in the morning. Sun's coming up, and now you go into this next step, Sha-Qing. You're only doing it for a couple of minutes. It's only 3, 4 minutes that the tea leaves get in the cooker. And it's extremely important to focus even though you've been up all night. You've gotta kick it into gear and get through this next step, because if you leave the leaves inside the cooker even just 30 seconds to a minute too long, it can burn the leaves really easily. I mean, this thing is super hot. And if you burn the leaves, it's very noticeable. So in the finished leaves, if you Sha-Qing for too long, you'll be able to see little burn marks, little black spots on the leaves. You'll also have this slight charred, burned aroma to it, and that's not good. So we need to make sure the leaves don't stay in too long, but we got to make sure they stay in long enough. If it's even 30 seconds a minute too short, we're not going to deactivate the enzymes completely. That flavor that we worked so hard to develop through withering and bruising, it's going to continue changing. We're not going to be able to stop the enzymatic process right where we want it.
根据它那个摇青出来那个结果，你要杀青出来之前，你要闻一下它那个香气，是怎样的，然后你杀的过程中，我们大概这里是用那个滚筒嘛，滚筒杀青机，大概我们用的温度是230到260之间这个温度去杀那个乌龙茶，
对，比绿茶少一些，
对，比绿茶少一些，绿茶可能去到280，都有300都有，这样子。整个杀青的过程就是我们采取一些焖杀这样子，就焖多然后其实跟绿茶也差不多这个原理，然后我们杀青出来闻，杀青之前闻一下那个香气，然后它杀青好了以后，它会通过那个机械散发出一种很高纯的那种香气，证明这个茶杀青好了，然后我们就看一下那个缸，留意一下那个变化。其实跟绿茶的判断也差不多。
Whether or not the enzymes are completely denatured, it depends on the cultivar, it depends on what season you're in, it depends on how long you did the last 2 steps, the withering and the bruising, you know, when did you decide to stop those? depends on the water content in the leaves. So these all impact how long you do the Sha-Qing step. So you kind of dial it in, you get the time right, you get the temperature right, and then you Sha-Qing 3 to 5 minutes about, and that is about it. The enzymes become denatured. You've stopped those enzymatic processes that are influencing the catechins, that are influencing the terpenoid volatiles. So this is a big step. After this, the last 2 steps are a little bit less intense, but it's still important to get these last 2 steps. Okay, Sha-Qing is done. The next step is rolling. With rolling, it's pretty simple. You put it in this machine. Obviously, it used to be done by hand. You kind of rolled on a table, but now it's all mechanized. The machine is rolling the leaves. So green teas, black teas, oolong teas all get rolled, and they all get rolled for different times. But depending on the requirements of the tea, you roll for anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. What the rolling process serves to do is break down the cell walls a little bit more. It kind of extract and pull out some of these flavorful juices in the leaf and have them stick right to the exterior surface of the leaf. And what that does is when it comes time to pour the tea, to infuse it later, it makes it so the flavor comes out, infuses into the water relatively easily. For example, white teas are not rolled. For a white tea, you need to infuse it in hot water for 15, 20 or more minutes to really extract all the flavor out of the leaves. Rolling allows you later during the tea steeping to get the flavor out and make a really flavorful cup of tea without having to infuse the leaves for too long of a time. Rolling doesn't directly build or affect flavor. It is important to experiencing the flavor and extracting it when it comes time to prepare the tea later. So it is important. Okay, we have gotten to the last step, step 6, baking/drying. I say baking/drying because it's not just drying the leaves. It's also that we are baking them in a sense. We are creating new aroma compounds through adding heat. The aromas that we're building now are different than what we were doing before. Before, those were through enzymatic processes in the terpenoid metabolic pathway. Now we are creating Maillard compounds. And Maillard compounds are just the products of taking proteins, or specifically amino acids, and sugars, and then you add heat and bring them together. And those create aroma compounds that are, you can think of kind of like a barbecue. You know, you have just like sweet meat cooking, ribs that have been lathered with a sauce, or, you know, roasty, savory, nutty, just this really appetizing smell. And that's what we get when we bake the tea leaves. We're getting the amino acids in the tea leaves to react with the natural sugars in the leaves, and we add heat and create these Maillard compounds. So this is really important. Before, in the withering and the bruising, we created about 70 to 80% of the aroma compounds that are going to end up being really important to the total aroma profile. But now we are doing the last 20 to 30%. A really good oolong aroma is not just sweet and floral, but you also want that meatiness in there. You want these Maillard compounds that really make your mouth water, like you're smelling meat cooking at a barbecue. That's what we get with this baking stage. Again, like Sha-Qing, we need to bake long enough, but not too long, and we need to do it at a high enough temperature, but not so high that we scorch the leaves. So this is an art in itself, and again, like the other steps, how long and how hot we do the baking depends on a bunch of different factors. So we bake the leaves, we get that flavor formation, we take them out, we let the tea leaves kind of recoup, let them air out a little bit, and then we put them back in the oven, and then we dry them. We get the water content below 5%. That's kind of the international standard of when leaves are okay to be stored. If they're above 5%, then they can grow mold, they can go bad pretty easily, so we got to get it below 5%. And finally, we are done. Aroma has been formed. We have the terpenoids, we have the Maillard compounds. Our catechins have oxidized to that perfect middle point. Our flavor is defined by floral, sweet, fruity, with also a meatiness to it from those Maillard compounds. Our taste is balanced. It's smooth and mellow and sweet, but it also has some catechins remaining. It has that tannic structure to it, which is what we want. This is the ideal profile of high quality oolong tea. As you could see, it was all just us basically applying different stresses to the leaves, applying heat at the right time, waiting patiently at times. These are all processes that tea masters have been employing for hundreds of years. And it's only recently that modern science has been able to go in and explain, okay, this is plant stress response, these are the molecular mechanisms, but these are ancient tea production processes. The interesting thing is that none of this stuff that we talked about today can really be mechanized. You know, we had the leaf tossing part, that's been mechanized, the rolling has been mechanized, but really a lot of the steps involved, like when we go from one step to the next, or how long we're bruising and how long we're letting the leaves sit, all of these things are so variable from one batch to the next that it all has to be done by hand, by a person each time that we make the tea. It can't be automated. The point that I'm getting at by mentioning this is that every really good cup of oolong tea that you've had, on the other end of it had someone with a ton of experience working their tail off to do things just right, to develop the aroma and the taste, to get it just that way so that you can enjoy it.
整个工艺流程是不能停的，要不断地去观察茶，虽然也很辛苦，但是其实做茶这个累并快乐着，可以这样说吧。
累并快乐。
对对对。
累并快乐，可以可以。做乌龙茶是累并快乐。
对对对，其实做哪一个行业都是很辛苦的，但是其实刚刚我闻到那个香气，就感觉就很欣慰了。其实昨天晚上熬了一个通宵都没有感觉很辛苦，是吧？毕竟做出来那个香气很吸引我，就很吸引。包括我们从那个鲜叶采摘到那个茶杯，到我们茶客那里喝到，他们感觉好，是一杯好茶。就其实作为一个加工的人员，这个是需要做的东西，是职责上的问题，就是等于匠心做茶。对，
对，然后你终于可以泡出来，然后分享给你的朋友们喝一下，看他们的反应，就说啊这么香啊，这么好喝，那
其实那时候是感觉很欣慰的了，是吧？即使你熬多少个通宵做出一杯好茶，这个是非常好的事情。既然自己也可以学到技术，也可以分享给别人喝到好茶，这样子，
挺好，挺好。
So I hope that this conversation, this video gave you a good look into what oolong tea is and how it's made and what are the processes involved in the formation of aroma and taste in oolong tea, why it's difficult, why it's so variable, and importantly, why we should really appreciate it when it's done well and when it's done right. So if you liked this video, if you learned a thing or two, if you thought it was interesting, give me a like and maybe a subscribe. That would be really great. I'm just getting my channel started here. This is my first video. So I would love if you guys came over, hit the subscribe button and showed me some love so I can build this channel. There's nothing I would love more than to share the world of tea with as many people as I can. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. I am signing off. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay healthy, stay positive, keep sipping tea. One love.